So this book has been written during my sabbatical at Imperial College. And for those of you who are familiar with my work, this is very unrelated to my previous work. In some ways, it's quite a redirection of my research focus to a new topic, and hopefully a much more exciting topic, at least to me. So what I hope to achieve today is to share with you my views about what I think is wrong or problematic with the current economic system that is prevalent in the Western part of the world, and discuss why the efforts to fix the system have been failing. Even though this is more than half of the book, I plan to spend no more than half an hour on this, because I guess that 90% of you are familiar with 90% of these issues. So I want to leave time to discuss my analysis of these problems, and more importantly, the proposed solution, what I call the cooperative economy. We will not be able to cover all of it, but at least the foundations I hope to highlight, and this can serve as a backdrop for our follow-up discussion. So when we talk about societal grand challenges, there are many types of challenges. So which of these challenges I'm interested in this context? There are 5 main challenges. And the first one I'm focusing on my book has to do with the concentration of wealth and economic inequality. So here it's sufficient to look at the numbers, and you can see that about 1% of the population possess close to 50% of the wealth in the world, and about 50% of the population controls about 1% of the wealth. And this pyramid is becoming steeper by the year. In 2009, you needed about 380 billionaires to have the wealth of the poorest half of the population. A decade later, 26 billionaires would suffice. In the United States, 3 individuals have more wealth than the poorest half of the population. And you can see that even though the wealth of the rich has grown over the years, their contribution to the tax is not growing as much. So this demonstrates how since the 80s, the ultra-rich increased the wealth from 2% to 10%, but their tax contribution increased from 2% to 5% only. And this is in part because of tax evasion. And for instance, the big tech firms have avoided paying more than $150 billion in the previous decade. But part of it is because of government policies that have shifted the tax burden from corporations to individuals. And this is overall in about 100 countries covered by the OECD. So we see how in the 60s, the top 1% and the bottom 90% shared about 30% of the wealth. And moving to today, we see that the disparity has increased by more than 20%. This is driven in part by inequality in income, which is mostly visible in the United States, but we see how the rich become richer, the poor do not become much poorer because there is not much for them to lose, but the middle class is losing its power. What has been done about this? The main instrument that has been proposed is progressive taxation. But as I demonstrated earlier, what we see in most countries is actually regressive taxation. And even if you are able to institute progressive taxation, you can imagine that the rich, the corporations that are able to evade taxes today will not give up on their skills or motivation. And in fact, we see that the trends of globalization, digitalization, just make it more difficult for government to spread the tax burden more evenly. Other approaches involve the public services transfer, both public sector and non-governmental programs that are basically offering different types of support to the needy population. But what they do is to make this population more dependent. And this is not true freedom. You're not providing them with the means to succeed in our economic system, but you're just throwing them some bones. And this is not efficient by itself. And in some countries where they tried the universal income and other types of support, this is not sustainable and has some side effects. It hasn't proven effective. Another approach has been to use automation, digitalization, to provide the working class with more time, with greater earning. But in fact, this benefits the capital owners, not the workers. Other policies like international migration have their own challenges, and they are not necessarily creating more equality. And if you were hoping that the unions will represent the workers and improve their position, then the unions have been losing power and membership over the years. So who is the beneficiary of this economic system? The main beneficiaries are the big tech firms that control the market through their platform ecosystems. You can see this, for instance, in the list of the richest companies based on market cap, and clearly all the big tech firms are featured on the top of this list. And the way they've done this is by leveraging the externalities of the internet. So in the 90s, in the late 90s, if you studied internet companies, the hope was that they will relieve us from the Goliath, from the big companies in the brick and mortar world. But in fact, these Davids didn't beat the Goliaths, they became the Goliath themselves. And they've done so by differentiating the products and servicing, attracting customers, leveraging the network externalities, the winner-take-all positions, and also driving out their competitors. And you might wonder, what about antitrust and other types of protection? Where the antitrust regulation was meant to deal with conditions where you restrict output and increase prices. But this is not the case here, because in digital platforms, you have more variety, more offerings, and the products are always, most times, offered for free. So this is definitely not applicable. Instead, we see that these big tech companies have been using various business practices, such as present preset defaults and self-preferencing. For instance, in Google, you see how the area devoted for their own offerings or to sponsored ad has increased over the years. And they also challenge their competition by acquiring those more attractive competitors. If you think, for instance, about Meta acquisition of WhatsApp and Instagram. Well, what about the complementors, those vendors that operate on these platforms? You would have expected that they would get a fair share of the benefits because they are helping these platforms to create value. But what we see is that the platform owners are dictating terms. They, for instance, in the context of Apple, they are charging, and Google also charging very high fees, like 30%, and very few companies like Epic Games are able to challenge this. So they also offer free substitutes. They are gathering data on the business of these complementors, and then they are either acquiring them or substituting them. And in a way, they are serving as gatekeepers between the vendors and the consumers, and they restrict the benefits to these complementors. What about consumers? You would expect that they would benefit from this scenario. But in fact, what we see is that over time, these platforms increase the switching costs. They limit the options for these consumers. The high commissions translate to higher prices eventually. And the elimination of competition also restricts option. And we see that many of these companies are not really concerned about the welfare of the consumers. For instance, if they are getting paid by the vendors for advertisements, an example would be Meta, who prefer to increase their advertising at the expense of the well-being of some of the users, despite knowing that this creates harm. Even the employees are not always better off. So the owners of these platforms, of course, are very rich, and some high-level programmers or system administrators would benefit as well. But many of these employees are mistreated, and we have seen many cases in the news. And they have been applying approaches such as Taylorism and surveillance, to increase efficiency, to silence some calls. And we've seen in many cases like Uber that they were not offering many benefits that you would expect from this kind of employers. So what has been done about this? mostly policy making, regulation, antitrust laws, law enforcement. But as I mentioned, it's very difficult to apply antitrust laws, existing laws, to this situation. There have been an attempt to revise these laws, but still it's very difficult. If you consider how many antitrust cases we've seen among these big tech companies, I think now we have one with Google. It has been many years since we've seen a major case filed against these companies. One turning point was the House Judiciary Committee report of the Congress in 2020, which suggested very extreme measures, even breaking up these platforms, preventing self-preferencing, data sharing, etc. But these recommendations were not materialized in any law so far. So it seems that even if you try to implement some of these measures, the stakeholders would not necessarily be the beneficiaries of this, because if you break up these companies, you weaken them, then the substitutes would be the Chinese alternatives, and the fact that you are creating weaker and less efficient companies doesn't necessarily benefit the stakeholders. And also the adjustment of the current antitrust regulation is not trivial. It's very difficult to deal with situations where there is no direct harm to consumers if it is, for instance, the complementors or the competitors that are being affected. And clearly, the big tech companies are not going to stand by. They have been applying their lobby already. In the US, the regulation has been lagging behind. So we see that in Europe, there have been efforts to advance regulation like the Digital Market Act that is in a kind of a paradigm shift, because it puts the burden on the companies, and the expectation is that they will be acting in a self-regulatory position. But this expectation is a bit naive. It's first of all, unclear when these companies are defined as gatekeepers. It's not clear what are the boundaries of the digital forum, if you think about companies like Amazon that also operate in the physical space. And the regulation itself has many loopholes, and the concern is that it might create more harm than good if you consider the implications for innovation and the lack of benefits for some of the stakeholders. So one of the main tools of these companies is being using private data. And here the concern is not only the loss of data privacy, but also what I call the loss of private choice, which we see now even more so with the emergence of artificial intelligence. So it's not a secret that the big tech companies know about us more than we know about ourselves, because we are quite limited cognitively in our ability to process data, but their algorithms and the processes are much more efficient. They pull data from many sources across many websites and create this personalized profile of each user, which they use in order to influence decisions. And even though it seems that users get access to some of these services for free, it comes with a price tag. And we've seen some of this in the cases of the Cambridge Analytica or the OpenAI cases, where it was clear that these companies are abusing the data, the private data, and trying to exploit the users. So the issue is that even if you give consent to use your data, you have limited control over what happens with it after you gave consent. And these companies are using algorithms which are not transparent, and besides being subject to biases, manipulation, psychological harm, are also eventually making the users and the stakeholders worse off in terms of their welfare and utility. And we've seen some of this in the case of the navigation system that failed, but also when you think about your freedom on these platforms, about 80% of the movies on Netflix are driven by algorithms, 30% of the purchases on Amazon. So the question is, with the emergence of artificial intelligence, what choice do consumers have, and what are the implications? There are broader implications for society when you think about hate speech, or the fact that 64% of those joining extremist groups are prompted to do so by algorithms. There is manipulations in the context of politics, and now with the elections, and the regulatory agencies are not well equipped to deal with these emerging technologies. The main maybe most established successful tool is GDPR, which we are all familiar with. And I checked today, and there were about 4.4 billion euros, I think, or dollars in terms, I think it's euros, I have to fix it, euros in terms of fines that were issued. But this is really a drop in the sea if you consider the benefits to these companies. It's about 1 to 15, the ratio of the fine to the benefit that you get from violating the users' rights, and not everyone is being caught or charged. And if you look at the distribution of charges, then most of them are about simple things like data gathering and access. Very few consider the violation of the rights of the users. And besides that, it puts more burden on the small companies that cannot afford to deal with the administrative implications. And we see that there are still some rights that fall between the seats, and reference to European charters that are not necessarily applicable to companies. So there is still more work to be done in that domain. But it's much better than what we've seen in the US, where there is recognition that the best evidence of the platform market power is not the high prices, but the loss of data privacy. But in this particular report, 450 pages, and no single recommendation about data privacy. The hope was that the companies that operate in the US will be still subject to GDPR because it is not limited by geographical scope, but clearly the US is lagging, and we see how the algorithms become more invasive and more discriminatory and manipulative in many ways. All of these algorithms and systems are designed to do one thing at the end. What they are trying to do is to convince us to consume more, to consume beyond our needs. And we see this with several indicators. For instance, in the US, we see that there has been an increase in terms of calorie consumption, in waste of food, in material extraction. It's more than 650% between 1990 and 2006. It's much higher than the growth in the population. And most of this consumption is concentrated in rich countries. The problem is that we consume more than the regenerative capacity of the planet, about 20% per year. So the forecast is not promising. The only downwarding graph I have in the book is the one representing the fall in the population of animals, at least those that are monitored. And this trend is not related to population growth, because we see it's directly related to the growth in GDP. And it is mostly the richest companies where we see limited population growth, where we have most of this consumption. And the question is, why do we overconsume? It's going back to the issue that the psychology of this corporation is to convince us that consumption would make us feel well. But this is really short-term effect, and it doesn't guarantee happiness. In fact, you can show that the consumption itself is not creating happiness. It's the comparison to others that create this temporary satisfaction. And there is a dilemma here, because we consume at the expense of others and the expense of future generations. And there have been attempts to deal with this, for instance, with SDG 12, but it focuses on production efficiency, not on consumption limits. And the advertising efforts that have moved to the digital media are serving the purpose of creating this increased consumption, which translates to overproduction. And we can go through each of the industries and see how they create damage. For instance, in agriculture, we see that most of the agriculture is industrial. We see that in fishing, about 95% of the ocean damage and 85% of the plastic in the sea is caused by industrial fishing. You can consider, for instance, in fashion, the increase in seasons. Think about Shane with 2,500 new models every day. And if it takes about 2,000 liters or more for one t-shirt, you can imagine the damage to the environment. I will not elaborate on this because this is probably well familiar to many of you. The question is, what has been done about this? So one effort has been corporate social responsibility, sustainability policies, but here most of the corporations pursue that to improve their differentiation, to increase their financial performance. And at some point, some companies also engage in greenwashing, just trying to gain from this perception without making a real impact on the environment. So think about British Petroleum rebranding itself to Beyond Petroleum and investing more in the campaign than they invested in new sources of energy. About 96% of their work is still oil and gas. So this would be just one example how this approach is not really effective. There are other approaches under SDGs 7, 12 to 15 that focus on different types of the environment, but they, first of all, they are internally inconsistent. For instance, SDG 8 tries to secure decent work conditions and economic growth. How can you do that if you want to limit consumption? Most of the focus is on efficiency of production, recycling, dealing with waste, not with really limiting the source of the problem. And the issue is that we have rebound effects. For instance, most of the plastic is not recycled, but in those countries like Germany where recycling is quite advanced, these are the countries where we see the most consumption of plastic. If you think about the improvement in fuel efficiency of cars, what we see is a growth in the size and the consumption of fuel on average over the years. So there is a kind of a rebound effect that nullifies this effort. So overall, this exploitation of resources, pollution, biodiversity loss is driven by overconsumption, public policy, international trade. It's very difficult to undo this. What we would have wanted to see is reduction in consumption, but this is not working well. So there are many approaches, slow consumption, reasonable consumption, voluntary simplicity that try to limit consumption or reuse materials and products, but this has remained as a voluntary effort that didn't produce a significant effect. So the outlook here is quite grim. We see that before AI, all of the top 5 global risks that the World Economic Forum identified had to do with the environment. We see decline in most indicators, and it's unclear how this can be remedied if we still want to secure the well-being of the poor population. And many countries, and also internationally, there are conflicts of interests of countries that wish to retain a certain level of growth with policies that are supposed to protect the environment. I would conclude with one other force, which has to do with globalization, which I would argue reinforces all of these other interlinked 4 problems. So globalization by itself has created many merits. Me personally, I'm quite grateful to globalization, allowing me to move from the Middle East to the United States to study, and then to Europe to work. So some individuals, some countries really benefited from globalization, but not all, especially those poor countries that are not celebrating the involvement in this free trade and movement of employees and resources. We see that they haven't benefited, but even in the rich countries that do benefit from globalization, certain sectors of the economy are disadvantaged. So if you think about traditional industries in the United States and other developed countries, these sectors have been pretty much moved to developing countries, and this leads to job loss, and whatever the compensation is or the remedies, it's not sufficient to compensate for this job loss. And even if you look at countries like India, China, Indonesia that have gained from this trend, then they do not really enjoy the employment conditions and the social benefits that the Western employees used to have before this trend. So this globalization reinforces inequality both within countries and across countries. And we see that governments have limited toolkits to deal with multinational corporations, which are the main beneficiaries here. So they receive subsidies, they are able to optimize production, to locate their activities in ways that enhance efficiency, but countries cannot really effectively deal with these multinationals despite recent developments in international taxation. So what we see even in China is that even though on average everyone saw some income growth, then the inequality has increased, and now it's even more challenging to make a living in China than it used to be before they opened their market. So other problems with globalization have to do with the fact that it weakens the value chain. We've seen this with events such as the financial crisis, the tsunami in Japan, COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, where you have a local problem that becomes a global problem because of this global economic system. The hope was that globalization will lead to exchange, sharing of ideas, cultures, but what we've seen instead is the emergence of a much more unified, consumeristic, capitalistic culture that weakens local societies and communities and leads to the preference of capital gain at the expense of values, support, and ethics in many countries. So what has been done about this? Not much. There have been many policies proposed, mostly by the OECD, which is trying to promote globalization, but realizes that without fixing some of the side effects, it would be difficult to achieve its purpose. So efforts like the Global Compact of the United Nations some years ago failed. And now in the past years, we've seen a trend of trying to convince multinational corporations and corporations by large to change their corporate purpose, to pursue more social corporate purpose. And many of our colleagues are publishing books and articles about revisiting the corporate purpose. Good luck with that. I doubt that this would show systemic change in our economy, because again, we have this conflict of interest where these companies first and foremost have to serve their shareholders. And indeed, in one of the reports of the OECD, I found the most candid conclusion, which is we urgently need to fix globalization, but we don't fully know how. So if you know how, call the OECD. I'm sure they'll be happy to hear from you. So I spent about almost half an hour describing the problems that we face with our economy, and this is quite depressing. And in fact, I was very careful in my book not to make claims that I cannot fully support by other sources, but from my conversations, I realized that the situation is much worse than I describe in my book. So the question is, what to do about this. And first of all, what is the root cause of these problems? So many focus on the symptoms. They focus on regulation, they focus on taxation, they focus on structural problems in this market or another market, but these are just the symptoms. If you delve deeper, you'll see that there is one common theme that emerges in all of these discussions. And this is the fact that in our economic system, profit maximization, utility maximization, self-interest receive priority over societal values such as sustainability, equality, and well-being. Now, the problem is that it's not just that the system allows for this, the system promotes and celebrates this. And even in our profession, in business schools, you see that we teach these cases to business students about the success of companies like Google and Amazon. And students, and not only students, but everyone admires those entrepreneurs who were successful in following these market rules and creating and capturing values. I wouldn't blame those entrepreneurs, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, for basically excelling in what we teach in our business strategy classes. I also would not blame us. We can be blamed for reinforcing this, but we are just teaching the rules of the game, and these are the rules of the economic system. This is how it is designed. So the problem has to do with the DNA of the economy. The fact that it is designed to achieve growth and to maximize profit utility to those who have strengths. And this is self-reinforcing because the more market power you have, the more you're able to profit at the expense of others. And this is very difficult to undo. And you cannot really put a band-aid on the system and expect this bleeding to stop you. The problem is with the DNA. So what can you do? And the issue is that all the regulation, legislation, and efforts to restrict this inherent behavior are too weak to restrain it. And on the other hand, we don't have strong incentives to promote sustainability, data privacy, the interests of shareholders, and there are these self-reinforcing dynamics. Now, you might say that this has always been the case in a capitalistic system, and you might be right. What's different now is technology. So in the past decades, we've seen the introduction of digital technologies, which are much more meaningful than the previous industrial revolution. So with these technological platforms, companies are able to excel and bring this economic system to a higher level of efficiency, and we see increasing exploitation and leveraging of our weakness. And you might say, well, we should have done something about this, but inherent to this system is the suppressing of the ability of societies to deal with this situation. So especially now with the emergence of AI, it's very clear that machines are taking the lead and humans follow. And we are, in a way, giving up on decision rights and choice. And this comes at a cost not only to ourselves, but also to society. The entrepreneurs are following the rules of the system, but these rules of the system are misaligned with the unwritten rules of society. So my conclusion is that the root cause of the problem to be observed, the societal grand challenges, is at the micro level. The problems are at the macro level, but the root cause is at the micro level. The system is reinforcing opportunistic behavior, which is driven by greed. And we see that the digital platforms are a very effective infrastructure for reinforcing this system and allowing it to conquer and pollute the mind and the soil. So this is the problem. And you can try to think about why we are falling short of handling this problem or solving it. So if you look at some of the policies and approaches that I discussed earlier, you realize that most of them are concentrating on a very narrow problem, like recycling or efficiency of production or data privacy. But all of these problems are interconnected, and there are interdependencies and trade-offs. For instance, once GDPR was introduced, then Apple used this new regulation to take advertising revenue from Meta by telling Meta, well, because of the new regulation, now we cannot allow you to use your advertising algorithm, and Apple used this new regulation to its advantage, or it can use some regulation to reinforce its position compared to contestants that don't have sufficient resources. So there is narrow focus on one problem which can amplify another. The problem is global. So if you have a national policy that tries to push something, then it will come at the expense of another country. When you think about moving waste from one country to another, it doesn't solve the problem to shift it to someplace else. And regulation, legislation, the main tool to deal with many of these problems is very weak and slow. It takes many years to recognize a problem like self-preferencing. Then it takes many years to craft a draft of this regulation to reach consensus. So by then, by the time you apply this, 20 years have passed. It's impossible to undo history and fix the structure of the market with this regulation, and the big tech firms can easily maneuver and bypass the regulation because business model innovation is very swift. We've seen, for instance, when Apple was informed that they cannot use this 30% commission anymore, they said that's okay, so we'll just charge a certain price for every user, and they can make even more money. So it's very difficult to chase this moving target with regulation and legislation, and the regulators, the authorities don't have enough expert resources, the courts don't have enough capacity to deal with these issues. But the main problem is that all of the stakeholders in the economy have vested interest in retaining the existing system. So governments, they want to see continued growth in GDP. They don't want to see collapse of the stock market. They don't want to see unemployment. So why would they push toward the growth? You think about corporations, they are still committed to their shareholders. They have to maintain the profits and revenues. They are not going to shoot themselves in the foot. Their employees also want to secure their employment, their conditions. They don't want to be left outside. And the consumers, they want to enjoy life. They want to continue consuming. So if there is one shared motivation of all of the participants in the system is to keep it as it is. So this is another type of problem, the misalignment of incentives. And as I mentioned, the issue is that all of the treatment focuses on the symptoms. Nothing here tries to deal with the motivation, with the incentives, with the root cause of the problem, greed. And this combination of reasons explains why we are at a standstill, why we cannot really fix the problem. So by now, I'm sure that you are all very depressed. The question is, what can be done about this issue? So unfortunately, I believe that we cannot fix this economic system. It's unfixable. It's destined to basically collapse on its own if we continue with this increasing symptoms of inequality, for instance. What we can do is to think about creating a new alternatives. And to do so, we need to basically go back to the drawing board. We need to revisit some of our fundamental assumptions, try to challenge our conventional thinking, trying to relax some constraints, things that we take for granted, focus on the root cause, and try to think about how to design an economic system that prioritizes societal values before profit making and utility maximization. But this requires really dealing with the core issues and not just applying a quick fix and looking at the symptoms. And for start, we have to go back to consider what are the working assumptions of our economic system. And this brings us back to economics 101, where the focus has been on the motivation, where we assumed that companies seek to maximize profits, consumers seek to maximize utility. We took it like a force majeure, like a law of physics, but it need not be the case. So in fact, usually the person who's to blame for this is Adam Smith. But if you read the work of Adam Smith, this is not what he envisioned. In fact, he had a book that focused on other types of value and recognized that there is a variance in the motivation of participants in economic exchange. I will get to that later. And the issue is that in my field, strategic management, we rarely challenge these assumptions. This is what we teach in business strategy. When you think about models like the five forces, then it's clear that it's trying to benefit yourself at the expense of others, even customers and suppliers. But there is actually some work that challenges this assumption, but on the other extreme. So work on transaction cost economics argues that, in fact, individuals can be assumed to be opportunistic. So unless you constrain them in a way, then they will not stop at moral boundaries and will exploit others, even if it violates some social norms. But deep in your heart, or if you read the work in behavioral economics and psychology, you realize that these assumptions are not correct. And in fact, even in microeconomics, the notion of utility originally was the attempt of economists to measure happiness. It's just that they couldn't really find a good way to capture it, so they tried to simplify it based on willingness to pay. But what we humans seek at the end of the day, if our physical needs are secured, is to be happy. And there are many ways to be happy. One way is, of course, to enjoy your utility consumption, but that's not the only way. And not everyone is opportunistic, and even those who are opportunistic need not necessarily demonstrate opportunistic behavior. This is the work of Ghoshal and Moran, for instance. So the issue is that research in economics strategy is not right, not in making the assumption that individuals are opportunistic or pursue self-interest, but in making the assumption that everyone is following this direction. And in fact, humans are quite different from each other. You cannot make assumptions that everyone follows the same motivation. I'll give you some examples. So in a special SMJ issue that I edited together with colleagues in 2018, we had a paper that focused on the beer industry in the US and showed how some boutique breweries are helping newcomers to the industry with regulation, marketing, with sourcing of materials. So why are they helping their competitors? You can see this also in the Silicon Valley, where you have established companies helping startups. You can see this in the workplace, where you have employees helping co-workers that are new to the job. So these are cases where they are helping others at a cost. The question is why they do that. The reason they do that is paid forward, because someone helped them when they enter the market or when they join the workplace, and they have this sense of gratitude that they need to pay it back. They cannot pay it back to those who help them because they don't need their help, but they can help third parties, and this is indirect reciprocity. So this has the potential of creating a cascade of kindness in the community under the assumption that the help is genuine, that it is intentional and voluntary and costly to those who engage in these activities. And if you remember this movie, Paid Forward, it demonstrates this principle of paying it forward. But the question is, do we really need to be helped in order to help others, to show these acts of kindness? The answer is not necessarily. It is sufficient to observe others in our community and to be inspired to show these acts of kindness. And some individuals are not subject to any trigger. So you can think about those who are kind to others for a no material reason, and we call this prosocial behavior. So prosocial behavior is benefiting others, enhancing the welfare of others at a cost to oneself. And this is the mirror image of opportunistic behavior, which is benefiting yourself at the expense of others. Now, there is a debate in the literature whether what matters is the outcome, whether you enhance the welfare of others, or actually the intention is also important. And the extreme, you can think about altruism, which is where you do so without expectation for any kind of return. But even if you benefit from this behavior socially, you are still benefiting others. So to give you an example of such a prosocial behavior, you can think about the tradition of caffè sospeso in Napoli, in South Italy, where you go to the bar and you order coffee. In Italy, you drink coffee in the bar, and you pay for two. One is for you, and one you put in the jar for some future customer who might come, who may not have sufficient funds to get the coffee, and then they can borrow this deferred payment and get the coffee for free. So this is an example of how you benefit someone in your community without even being aware who this is. Now, I want to do a short experiment with you and to use this example of someone leaving food on the street in Toronto in order to support the poor. So what do you think happened when this gesture took place in Middle Toronto, when someone left some food and left also a clear sign saying, if you need food, if you are hungry, you are welcome to take food that was left. What you can write in the chat. What do you think was the outcome of this natural experiment? How did people react to it? Okay, so some believe that the food was left untouched. Some believe that other people came and added their own food. Some grabbed food and starting reselling it. Okay, so all of the answers are right. Let's see what happened. So some people are taking, which is what was intended. Some people are actually inspired and leave food and other items on the ground. You can see that most of the people just follow the instructions. They are taking the food if they are really in need. So handicapped, old people. But then, as some people, we also have those participants who arrive and just take everything, even though they have no need. So this short video basically demonstrates to you that the motivation of individuals, their inclinations are quite diverse. And we see evidence for this in behavioral economics. So the experiments that have been carried out and the results are shown here, demonstrate that about 30% of the population exhibit high level of prosocial behavior. 23% demonstrate opportunistic behavior, and most of the participants are conditionally prosocial. What this means is that they will be kind to others if others are kind to them, or if they observe kindness in their community. But if they observe opportunistic behavior, they will not be behaving prosocially. If someone exploits them, they will not be kind to others. So the question is, what drives prosocial behavior? Who is prosocial and why? So some of it has to do with personality, and specifically there is research showing that honesty, humility, fairness are linked to prosocial behavior. Some of it has to do with culture, your country of origin, where you grew up. If in your country there is respect to the law and to others' rights, or actually we can see abuse. It has to do with religious beliefs, spirituality, that are also promoting prosociality. It's more common in a smaller group that are more cohesive. And on the other hand, we see that sometimes there is more disengagement. So if you have an environment where it becomes normative to mistreat others, to exploit, then people at some point consider this as something normative and don't feel discouraged to engage in this behavior. So some individuals will engage prosocially because they have the natural inclination to do so, because they believe in the good cause. Others would follow the norms. So to give you an example, in Fiji, there is a tribe where the tradition has been to share your food with others in your tribe. And if you wouldn't do that, then at some point they would come and they will torch your house and the houses of your family members. They loot your produce, and this demonstrates why there is a clear alignment with these social norms. And the question is, does prosociality pay off? We know that opportunistic behavior pays off. You get to increase your welfare at the expense of others, but does prosociality pay off? It does. So it does emotionally. So there is research showing that those who are helping others, who benefit others, are happier, that they demonstrate higher levels of well-being, positive affect, greater life satisfaction, especially if they can observe the outcomes of their good behavior and they are somehow connected to those that they are helping. So prosocial behavior pays off, and if you believe in karma, then maybe it can also pay off economically, but at least emotionally it does pay off. So why don't we see much of it? why don't we see much pro-social behavior in our economic system? Let me answer this with an experiment of Dan Ariely. He tied the well-equipped bike in the center of New York and put a camera to observe what happens with the bike. And for 250 days, no one touched the bike. Then at about day 260, someone took the water bottle from the bicycle. And within a couple of weeks, the bicycle was completely dismantled. This demonstrates to you the power of norms. So if the norm is don't touch someone else's property, people follow the norm. If the norm is changing and it becomes you are free to take someone else's property, people follow the norm. The problem with our economic system is that the norm is a norm of exploitation. And whenever you see that people follow this norm, it is being reinforced. And on the other hand, even though pro-social behavior is also self-reinforcing, it's too weak to overturn the main tendency to behave opportunistically. And we see this small disengagement, which I mentioned earlier. So the conclusion is that in any economic system, we have two forces, opportunistic behavior and pro-social behavior. The problem is that in our economic system, the design of the system reinforces opportunistic behavior, penalizes pro-social behavior, and we go beyond the tipping point where pro-social behavior is being restrained because of this self-reinforcing effort, and the opportunistic behavior is being increasing because of this reinforcing effect. So this is my analysis of the problem, but it is also the pathway for the solution. Because to solve societal grand challenges, at least those that are related to the economic system, all we have to do is to somehow push pro-social behavior so that it will reach beyond the tipping point, and the opportunistic behavior will start reducing its effect because of this competing self-reinforcing efforts. So the pathway for the solution is very simple, if I'm right, which is let's design an economic system that motivates pro-social behavior and penalizes opportunistic behavior. And if we're able to do that, then maybe we can deal with these societal challenges. So how do we do that? We already know what are the antecedents of pro-social behavior, and we can follow these antecedents to come up with design principles for the economic system that would promote pro-social behavior. So this is what I suggest in the book. And the idea is that we need to recognize that everyone needs to be taking some responsibility to make it work. So it's not only corporate social responsibility, which we emphasize in our current research, but it's a responsibility of every stakeholder in the economy. Employees, vendors, consumers, the platform, everyone needs to take some responsibility. The responsibility is distinct depending on the role of the stakeholder in the economy. And the design principles are encompassing both the social responsibility and the antecedents of pro-social behavior. So in my book, I discuss 15 design principles that if they are implemented, then we have a fair chance of enhancing pro-social behavior. And I will discuss this with you. And this is basically the foundations of what I call the cooperative economy. So the cooperative economy is an economic system that is ethical, it is community driven, it is focusing on the fair distribution of value and the promotion of societal value. It does, of course, provide the utility and profit and economic benefits, but these are not the main priority of this system. So the first design principle has to do with community focus. The current economic system is global. What I'm proposing is to shift to communities. And one advantage of communities is that within communities, which are usually bound geographically, then you have shared values, norms, beliefs, cultures, identity. And within that system, it's easier to build trust. It's easier to avoid opportunistic behavior when you know the other consumers, when you are interacting even physically with the sellers. And this comes in addition to other benefits such as reducing transportation distances, which helps with sustainability. It doesn't mean that all transactions will take place within communities, but the idea is to prioritize this localization and perhaps have the vendors contract with other communities and having consumers preferring to purchase from local vendors. So this is one design principle. Another one has to do with the question of who should be allowed to operate on this system. And the idea is that we do want to keep the system open, but in fact semi-open in the sense that we want to keep out those who behave opportunistically. So it's difficult to identify them in advance, although you can try. But what you can do is to penalize opportunistic behavior once you observe it. Then you can push out those who violate the rules of behavior. It's not much different than any kind of digital platform you have today where they have their list of acceptable behaviors, and if you are violating the rules, you'll be kicked out of Instagram or X or whatever platform it is. And the idea is that this system is more inclusive in the sense that it doesn't exclude those that are poor, who do not have enough financial resources. Unlike the current economic system, it excludes those who behave opportunistically. One way to achieve that is, for instance, to ask every new member to get referrals from existing members. And these existing members wouldn't want to have someone exploit them. So they would be very careful in giving these recommendations. And in the book, I discuss more nuanced practices for how to use this principle. The main design principle of the cooperative economy has to do with price subsidization. The idea here is that the tax system hasn't been effective. And for instance, when you pay taxes, most of you are not happy. You feel that something has been taken from you. But if you are helping someone in your community, this is a form of prosocial behavior that generates emotional benefits. So you'll be actually happy to donate to someone in need in your community, most people. So the idea is to do that with the price mechanism. So if we go to a bar in Italy to buy coffee, then I would pay a higher price for the same coffee as my student will pay less for the same coffee. And in a way, I'm subsidizing this student by paying a higher price. Moving forward, this student will become an executive one day. I will retire. Our income ratios will flip. And then this student, assuming the paid forward mechanism, will actually be feeling a sense of gratitude and be happy to support others in the community, including myself. The question then is how to set the prices in such a way that will not steer away the high income earners. So how not to make them feel exploited or avoiding paying the high prices. On the other hand, how to keep it in such a level where the subsidized low earners would not free ride and will not reduce effort. I'll get back to that in a moment. Another design principle has to do with limiting consumption, because if we subsidize the poor, we give increasing their purchasing power, then they are likely to consume more, and this will exacerbate another problem that we are sought to deal with, which is the overconsumption. So the idea is to put consumption limits. And the question then is what these consumption limits should be and how to enforce them, because clearly if it's a digital platform, and I'll get to that in a moment, the consumers can easily go and purchase more products and services outside of the system. And the idea is that having these limits, at least as nudges, it's still beneficial from a psychological standpoint, where you can see that there is a limit and some would follow it. And you can set this based on the average level of consumption or a bit higher. You can think about complementarity. So if I like to consume more apples as opposed to oranges, then there are many ways to make it more refined. But the idea is that you want to have these consumption limits. These are the social responsibilities of consumers. On the side of the vendors, you also want to have profit limits. There is nothing wrong with profits. There is a lot wrong with excessive profit, because if profit is unlimited, at some point to make an extra buck, you actually need to cross certain moral boundaries. At some point, you have to exploit others at some social cost. And therefore, if you know that beyond a certain limit, whatever earning you get extra is being redistributed to consumers, it takes away the motivation to exploit, and it takes away the motivation to behave opportunistically on the side of the vendors. But how exactly can we find what are these profit caps, consumption limits, pricing? This is a very complicated problem. This is exactly where we need digital technology. So in our current economic system, as I briefly mentioned, we are using machine learning, artificial intelligence, algorithms to exploit stakeholders. This is what companies are using these algorithms for. But the technology is neutral. It will serve whatever purpose and objective function you give it. And if we ask this technology to serve society, it will do it more efficiently than any decision maker. So the idea is to use these algorithms to optimize prices, profit caps, consumption limits in such a way that will support sufficient activity on the system and high level of satisfaction, while keeping with the social commitments and the values that we want to preserve. There are many other elements, for instance, quality. Obviously, in the current economic system, there is emphasis on quality, but it is not necessarily the main consideration. So, for instance, when you go on Google and you look for companies or services, those who will be featured are those who paid Google a higher price, not those that are most suitable for your needs. So the idea is to try to institute quality assessments and to use them to prioritize vendors so that you will be able to access high quality vendors. But it's not just quality. You want to make sure that the price is low, the quality is high, sustainability score is high, and the distance is short to the consumer. So you can take these 4 parameters and optimize the chosen vendor to serve any particular customer at any given moment. But you wonder why can we trust this system if we see that the current digital platforms are self-preferencing, they're promoting their own products and services, they are doing the delivery, etc. Well, in this system, the platform operator will not be able to sell any product or service. So the platform will be just an infrastructure, and it will not compete with vendors that will offer products and services. And it also would promote competition by securing market share to those newcomers to the system. So as a new vendor, you will have guaranteed market share until at least you have sufficient feedback from consumers so that you can be rated like any other vendor on the system and ranked based on the same criteria. So this system is actually not communism. It's more, in some respects, more capitalistic than capitalism, because it offers real opportunities and real freedom, not only to companies that want to enter the market, but also to consumers, to individuals. For instance, in the current economic system, if you are an opera singer, you are a dancer, you're an artist, most likely that you will be working in a supermarket or in a restaurant to make a living, and you will keep that as a hobby. But in this system, because there is mutual support, because there is price subsidization, because the purchasing power of the low earners is enhanced, then individuals will be able to pursue their real preferences, in terms of career opportunities, in terms of aspirations, and therefore they will be even more productive and motivated than they are in the current economic system. So this system is very entrepreneurial. I will go back to the issue of semi-open system. The idea is that to be part of the system, you have to be productive. So unless you are limited physically or mentally and you cannot walk, every user in the system has to contribute something to the system. So if you don't have a job, you are unemployed, the system will provide you with incentives and tools to start a business. And it promotes entrepreneurship because even if you fail, you know that you have this cushion, you have this mutual support from the community in the form of lower prices to the extent that your income is lower. Another dimension concerns advertising. There will be no advertising on this system. There will be no attempt to influence consumers' choices, behavior, preferences from within the system as done in the current system. So this is another element. In terms of employment, the idea is to reduce salary differences within companies. Currently, in the Fortune 500 list of companies, the ratio between the CEO and the median employee is about 325 in terms of the salary rate. There is no justification for that. So how can you reduce these salary differences? You make a requirement from any vendor who wants to sell on the system that they have to achieve these reduced salary differences, and they will have some time to do that, maybe 3 years or so. And in these 3 years, they will increase their sales, their market share, so they'll have a market incentive to keep working with the system. Now, you must be wondering, how can we trust this system operator? How can we know that it will not be like Meta or Facebook at the time that promised to the regulators that they are not going to link WhatsApp with Facebook data, and after they were approved by the regulator, they did exactly that? Well, this platform operator will not be an attractive option to companies, because besides being subject to the same rules like profit caps yourself, this company is more of a service company. It doesn't have products or services, and it has the greatest social responsibility in terms of what they're supposed to deliver. The vision is that eventually the system will be decentralized, so you will have local entrepreneurs serving as licensors of the system, and they will be representing the local community, and the main operator will inspect that they are following the requirements. In the system, there will be no shareholders, so you cannot really, obviously it will not be publicly traded, you cannot use capital to gain influence on the system, but every employee, customer, and vendor will receive one share, which is not tradable, but allows them to gain access to receive periodical reports, to vote on certain issues that concern them, and under certain conditions override, overrule, and replace the platform operators if they are not serving the stated purpose. So suppose that we see all of this working, that's fine, but how can we trust this platform on day one? For this, we need transparency, but the level of transparency should be much higher than what we have today. And today we have a lot of regulation, especially in Europe, that is trying to increase transparency. But the idea here is that the transparency will be at the level of the algorithm. There should be a third party, either independent or multinational, international association, that will have the right to go and check the algorithms of this platform and potentially other platforms, and conclude whether it serves its purpose. The final design principle is symbiosis. The idea is that this system doesn't replace the existing system, it supplements it, and for it to succeed, the current system has to prevail. And this is because we want to keep out the opportunistic players, so they should have an alternative where they can trade and gain access to products and services. So this system is not replacing the current system. So I mostly emphasized in my discussion the two-sided market platform of buyers and sellers, but this economy will also encompass a barter platform where you can exchange products and services without any monetary transfer, and the system will determine what is the exchange rate depending on your available income per capita. There will be also donation platform where you can donate products and services in your community. This will make it much more efficient than the current donation model, which is less efficient. So to summarize what is proposed here, this is a new type of economic system that is quite distinct from what we have now. In the current system, the focus is on profit and utility maximization. In the cooperative economy, it's about serving societal values. The current economic system emphasizes opportunistic behavior. Cooperative economy emphasizes prosocial behavior. In the current economic system, the focus is on value creation and capture. In the cooperative economy, it's about the fair distribution of value. The current economic system is global. The cooperative economy is organized around communities. In the current system, if you are in need, you are excluded. In the cooperative economy, if you are greedy, you are excluded. In the current system, the capital owners are the ones who benefit from the system. In the cooperative economy, the low-income consumers are benefiting more, relatively speaking. We see that in the current economic system, platforms like Amazon expand horizontally, vertically, they are unlimited. In the proposed system, they serve a very limited service function, and there is much more room for the interest of different stakeholders. We see that in the current system, the incumbents, the dominant companies have an advantage. In the cooperative economy, it provides incentive for newcomers, for startups. In the current system, the consumption is unrestricted, and the profits are also unrestricted, but in the cooperative economy, they are both restricted. There is more emphasis for sustainability. For instance, you can exclude vendors that do not meet certain thresholds in terms of sustainability. You have much more freedom of choice, both in employment and consumption, no one is trying to influence your consumption. The price is set based on income, not on willingness to pay. The barter and donation are not rare and voluntary, but built in the system. It's more protective of employment rights. It leverages technologies to strive toward cooperation as opposed to exploitation. The governance is not owner-controlled, shareholder-driven, but more decentralized and stakeholder-driven. The operations are more transparent. And the funding, the idea here is not to go to venture capital or to capital owners, but to rely on donation and crowdfunding. So I will conclude by calling for action and calling you, I guess that most of you are researchers, to continue and research this solution as well as other solutions for societal grand challenges. First of all, there are solutions. These societal grand challenges are human-made, and we humans, especially researchers, which have the capacity, we can come up with solutions, and I would urge you to challenge me, but empirically, test my ideas, prove me wrong. Don't just tell me that I'm wrong, because obviously there are many pitfalls that I also discuss in the book, and nuances that will determine whether this system is successful or not. It's mostly about how it is implemented, but it's easier to achieve systemic change through design principles as opposed to what we are doing now, which is striving for regulation, consensus, and political discourse. So let me finish with some optimism, because I started with some depression. I believe that we can solve these problems. And if we follow this route, we might end up with a system, economic system that serves society, as opposed to what we have now, which is society serving platforms. So let me stop here. I know that you raised a lot of questions and comments while I was discussing. So feel free to voice your question, and let's engage in discussion. So thank you for the attention, and let's see what you think about these ideas.
Thank you, Dovev, for this presentation that was indeed rich in ideas. I think it's fair to say that this was a sabbatical well spent, connecting a lot of issues that are usually treated separately. I have also indeed seen that there's a lot of questions that have been raised in the chat. Maybe you could stop sharing your slides so that we can see each other, and then people can start raising their hands to pose their questions to you directly. But,
I'm sure that you have many questions and comments. You had them in the chat, so just feel free to jump in. I didn't have time to read them while going through. So, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting presentation. Yeah, very inspiring ideas. I was just wondering, so the pro-social behavior plays a central role. One could also understand it, I assume, as pro-ecological behavior, maybe also. And I'm just wondering, the idea is, okay, you implement the system that facilitates pro-social behavior, and this helps us to solve the grand problems. I'm just wondering if pro-social behavior, pro-ecological behavior is always not self-contradictory sometimes. So that, for example, you also mentioned free consumption in your system. So if I think pro-ecological behavior would be, I assume, if I don't use a car with a combustion engine, but with an electric vehicle. But an electric vehicle is at the same time full of unsustainable elements, so to speak, in the value creation process. So I'm just wondering if can we solve these grand problems through pro-social behavior, or or how is it possible to solve these problems with free consumption in the end? That would be a question.
Okay. A very interesting comment. So you are right that the idea of pro-social behavior is quite broad. There are different interpretations. So some say you need intention, others say you don't need. What matters is the outcome. Some focus on interpersonal, and others say that if you are benefiting your community or the environment, it's another form of pro-social behavior. And in fact, what we see is that this system is designed to enhance all of these forms. So for instance, we have these consumption limits that are supposed to restrain consumption. We have a way to incorporate sustainability index in the preference of vendors and exclude vendors that are not meeting certain requirements and giving advantage to those who do. So I agree with you that there are many moving parts, and this is why the solution is quite complex, and why we need to rely on digital technologies, because the solution will not be analytic. The solution will be based on machine learning. There will be optimization and experimentation, and the issue is that it comes down to how to set the right parameters. Should the profit limits or the price be set in this way or another way? We can use technology to optimize this. And if we see, for instance, that consumption is getting out of control, or you see that sustainability is suffering, then based on the objective function you give to these algorithms, they will fine-tune and adjust the parameters to compensate for this. So the solution is technological. Okay, anyone else wants to voice their question? Okay, we have here Saskia, but if you can unmute.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for this very interesting presentation. Lots of interesting ideas there in terms of solutions. And I think a lot of these are being tried out at the micro level, or have been part of traditional or indigenous societies, for instance, indigenous values, etc. So, and it becomes a lot about co-opting governments, or rather, because existing governments are actually, supporting incumbents versus the 90% of the population who are kind of, say, low income. So how do you kind of, generate the political will to move into this new system?
So I don't expect the government, corporations, or consumers to do anything, because we've had these expectations and all of them pretty much failed. This is why the solution is government-free. There is no role for government here. In fact, a side effect of implementing the system will be even less responsibility of the government than we have today, because today the government is collecting taxes and offering services, support to certain communities in one way or another. Now, if the support is between individuals and companies within the community, then first of all, because of the profit caps, there will be less profits, less taxes. And also the government will have to provide less support to needy individuals, because they will be able to live with the lower income with this enhanced purchasing power. So in a way, not only that we do not rely on the government, we also reduce the responsibility of the government and shift focus to communities. Communities will have more responsibility, but also greater benefits within that system. Now, you raised indirectly another important point that I want to clarify. This system doesn't require any change in beliefs, motivations, mindset. It doesn't expect consumers to be suddenly more let's say, consume more reasonably, or from corporations to be less greedy, because the starting assumption is that there is a distribution of motivations already in society, and the current system is built around opportunism. So if you're opportunistic, you enjoy life. If you are prosocial, you suffer. In this system, it just creates a better alignment between the design of the system and the natural distribution of motivations in society. So those who behave prosocially, have this inclination, will be happy to behave naturally. Those who are opportunistic will be kept out, and those in the middle, the conditionally prosocial, will follow the norms. So they will see that the majority are behaving prosocially, and they will adapt to the norms because they just follow norms, whatever these norms are. So I'm not expecting to change government policies or to change consumers' motivation. This system is actually better aligned with the natural tendencies that are already there in the society.
Thank you, Professor.
Just to say, we have about 5 minutes left within the planned 90 minutes. So if there's a few other questions, yes.
Hi, could I?
Sure.
I put one on the chat about the fact that you've mentioned that business schools, and you should know, because obviously
me personally, I'm also
yes, and I found your book fascinating, as well as your presentation, by the way. And now, how do you envisage business schools to also present these alternatives? I suppose you are already doing so.
Yes.
And colleagues, there's a lot of research, as you said. Now, on a sort of a flip side, because of the last comment you've just made, these electronic platforms, they are costly to set up, or perhaps not as costly for those who already have the means, such as the dreaded Amazons, Apples, Googles, and so on. If I understood some notions in your book correctly of some elements of paradox, where social responsibility companies, basically a lot of companies are just presenting a sort of a clean face, but on the other hand, it doesn't really present any solutions, or then drives them to produce more, which generates a different type of problem. So what about putting the span in the works of encouraging companies like Amazon to create the alternative platforms for those of us who like the benefit of buying online, exchanging online, whether it is locally, preferably locally, but then to present the alternatives as a starting point, as part of their social responsibility. How would you envisage something like that?
So first of all, in terms of our responsibility as educators, our social responsibility, I'm trying in my courses, in the business strategy course, to have the last session focusing on this issue of grand challenges and economic systems. So even if I teach students about profit making, value creation capture, I also want them to get that part. And I know that many business schools now have some majors or minors in sustainability. So this, I think, is becoming something that students expect and business schools provide. And I'm sure it will get more momentum. The other question is more challenging. I don't think that we can expect Amazon, Google, and others to change their skin voluntarily. And even if they are forced to, they will do the minimum, or they will try to bypass these requirements, as we've seen with the recent regulation. And the reason is that because they operate in the current economic system. Within the current economic system, the incentive is always to create value at the expense of others, is to exploit. So this is why I suggested let's create another economic system. Now, once you have this alternative, then the established platforms will have more market incentive to align and provide similar types of services and enhance societal values, not because they are kind enough or realize this is the right thing to do, not because of regulation, but because they are losing market share, because they realize that now there is 30% of the population that prefers to operate on those competing platforms. So maybe they would try to grab this market share back. So the idea is that once you give an opportunity for new types of platforms, for these new types of ventures, it will also help the established players to align their behavior because there is a market incentive, because the self-interest and the society interest will be aligned. In the current system, there is a trade-off.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have Noreen.
Yeah, good afternoon from here. I was just able to catch up in the middle of the discussion, so I'm just wondering how your cooperative economy discussion is different from the current existing cooperatives at the moment. The reason why I ask is in the case of developing countries, lots of cooperatives are failure, and the assumption that everybody will be cooperative somehow doesn't hold true. And in terms of managing the business of those cooperatives, somehow they are incapable because they do not have the competencies to do so. And there are also lots of tensions existing among the stakeholders that may also affect their conflicting sort of goals.
Okay, so in the book I discuss how my proposal is different from many other alternatives, like cooperatives, like sharing economy, like kibbutzim, Bhutan, you name it. And there are many distinct factors. Specifically with cooperatives, they are just one stakeholder. They are the corporations, the vendors. So it's not encompassing the whole economic system. And even though they have some elements of this system, like equality in decision making, etc., they are serving the interests of their members, not of the whole society. And even if they benefit themselves at the expense of others, it doesn't help society by large. Furthermore, we see that usually they are limited in terms of types of product or service, scope, geographical location. The question is how to scale up. This goes back again to the issue that what we need to do here is not to update or change the components in the system, like consumers, vendors, etc. We need to change the DNA, the operating system of the platform. And this is very difficult for one stakeholder to achieve on their own, even if they are the government. So let me do an operational proposal here, which is to share with you this discount code for those of you who haven't read my book yet. So if you go on the website of the publisher, not on Amazon, then you can use this code to get 20% discount. And now I would be happy to stay for a few more minutes in case others have questions, etc. But I don't want to keep here those who have other things to do today and they still want to get a discount. So here you go. I see that Vladimir has a question or comment.
Yes. Hey, thank you for the interesting presentation. I have a couple of questions regarding the role of technology, because I'm slightly, well, not necessarily surprised, but I'm just wondering about, let's say, this positive image of technology that you have. And we could, for instance, counter that, let's say, the appropriate tech movement from the 70s, they argued you cannot only have rescue helicopters, right? You'll need the military helicopters too, because otherwise you can't run down the cost curve. So, or you could basically quote Kissinger, who said, well, we're mostly concerned with exploring the opportunities of technology, right? We don't necessarily sit back, look at it, and kind of do the philosophy behind the tech that we're developing. So I think that because the people who develop technology will be probably the same in your system than in this system, like opportunity inspired people. And how do you make sure that it's actually moving into the right direction, that we don't get what we have now, right? Like
yes. So first of all, if you read my book, you realize that my perception of technology is very, very negative. Okay. So I'm not sure at all if the big tech firms will be happy with my work. The only reason they haven't shown discontent is probably because this book is not well read yet. But I'm pretty much, for more than half of the book, I'm criticizing these technology companies, and I'm making them the center. Even though I discuss the economic system, my focus is on the big tech as a source of the problem. But my argument is that technology is neutral. It's not, the problem is not technology. The problem is what you do with these technologies. And current technology companies are following the current modus operandi in our economic system, which is created capture value. It's not about the fair distribution of value. So they use technology to achieve that very efficiently. Now, if you set the purpose as serving societal values and using technologies to serve societal values, then the system will achieve it at a much more efficient fashion. So my argument is that technology is both the problem and the solution, depending on what you decide to do with it. Currently, what we've seen is that it's mostly being used to exploit. But if you use it to serve society, it will do a pretty good job.
Okay. Well, I have not read your book yet, so I've picked up on this, on the thing that you said, the solution is technological. That's
also the problem is amplified by technology. So it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, that makes it
clear. Baria?
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to follow up the question that was just asked about, and then you kind of mentioned that technology is neutral. So I wanted to push back on that notion, because you talked about how technology uses algorithms, and it has been proven with research that a lot of these algorithms are biased towards people of color and towards different genders. So like, how can one address that, given that the algorithms that you kind of want to bring into sort of managing these grand challenges are already biased in the way they are written up?
Yeah, so I'm not talking about the current algorithms, which are biased and serving a different purpose. I'm talking about new algorithms that have to be written. So you can, obviously, algorithms are as biased as the inspiration and data that you introduce. But if you are inspired by serving society, and one of the societal values is equality, then the algorithms would pursue that. And I'm not, as I mentioned, I don't propose an analytical solution. I offer design principles. How you take these design principles and translate them into algorithms, that's an operational task. And obviously, the quality of the task will determine how effective the algorithms are in serving these design principles. So the first question is, do you accept these design principles? Do you think that they are fair and right? If so, then it becomes a technical issue how to implement them effectively. And of course, there are many ways to implement them, and some of them will create biases, but these are things that you can work on and improve while you do that. It's not a reason not to try it.